She taught Sunday school to half the town's children, organized every charity drive, and knew every family's deepest secrets. But when Margaret Hayes discovered what was really happening in the basement of Millfield Community Church, someone decided that God's most faithful servant had to die. Sunday, October 15, 2023, 6:47 a.m. Margaret Hayes should have been preparing for morning service, arranging flowers, setting out hymnals with the same loving care she'd shown for 12 years. Instead, she lay dead in the church sanctuary, a bullet through her heart and a financial ledger clutched in her cold hands. Welcome to Man's Dark Nature. I'm your host, and tonight we're exposing how a small town's most trusted institution became a cover for the ultimate betrayal. This is the story of how faith became a weapon, how trust became a trap, and how the very people sworn to protect their flock became wolves in shepherd's clothing. This is the story of Margaret Hayes and the dark secret that got her killed. Millfield, Tennessee. Population 4,200. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where church attendance is still considered a social obligation, and where the pastor's wife holds almost as much influence as the pastor himself. Margaret Hayes was everything a pastor's wife should be: gracious, devoted, and completely trusted by every family in town. For 12 years, she'd been the beating heart of Millfield Community Church, the woman who remembered every birthday, every anniversary, every family crisis. Miss Margaret, as the children called her, taught Sunday school with the patience of Job and the enthusiasm of a camp counselor. She organized the food drives that fed the town's struggling families, coordinated the Christmas pageants that brought the community together, and somehow always knew exactly what to say when tragedy struck. But Margaret Hayes had one quality that would ultimately sign her death warrant. She paid attention to details. Every donation, every expense, every dollar that flowed through the church's accounts. Margaret tracked it all with the precision of a forensic accountant. That attention to detail would uncover a secret so devastating that it would cost her everything. Fall of 2023. As the church treasurer's assistant, Margaret Hayes had access to financial records that most congregation members never saw. Bank statements, donation records, expense reports, the mundane paperwork that kept the church running. But Margaret was noticing patterns that troubled her deeply. Pattern 1. Cash donations were being recorded, then mysterious, administrative fees were removing the same amounts days later. Pattern 2. The building fund, money donated specifically for church repairs, showed deposits, but no corresponding expenses for actual repairs. Pattern 3. Most disturbing of all, the children's ministry fund, money given by loving families for youth programs, was being systematically drained through miscellaneous expenses. Margaret began asking questions. Polite questions at first, the kind any responsible volunteer might ask. Where was the building fund money going? Why weren't the children getting the programs their parents had funded? Who authorized these administrative fees? The answers she received were vague, dismissive, and increasingly hostile. Don't worry about it, Margaret. Focus on your Sunday school. The finances are more complicated than you understand. Trust the leadership, that's what faith means. But Margaret Hayes didn't trust blindly. On October 10, 2023, she did something that would seal her fate. She made copies of every financial document she could access and began her own investigation. Working alone in her kitchen, surrounded by bank statements and donation records, Margaret Hayes discovered a theft scheme so audacious it took her breath away. For over 3 years, the church's leadership had been systematically stealing from their own congregation. The building fund theft, $127,000 donated for church repairs, had been diverted to personal accounts. The church roof still leaked, the parking lot remained unpaved, and the heating system hadn't been fixed, but someone had gotten very wealthy. The children's ministry scam, $89,000 in donations meant for youth programs, summer camps, and educational materials, had vanished into administrative costs. Parents had sacrificed to give their children spiritual enrichment, only to be robbed by the very people they trusted most. The charity fraud, most devastating of all, money donated for local food banks and homeless shelters, funds given by families who had little themselves, was being pocketed by church leaders who preached about helping the needy while stealing from them. Total theft, over $340,000 stolen from a congregation that included single mothers, elderly retirees, and struggling families who gave what little they had because they believed it would serve God's work. On October 14th, Margaret called Pastor David Mitchell, the man she'd served faithfully for 12 years. She asked for a private meeting the next morning before service. She wanted to give him a chance to explain, to make things right. That phone call signed her death warrant. Sunday, October 15, 2023, 6:30 a.m. Margaret Hayes arrives at Millfield Community Church carrying a manila folder containing copies of every incriminating document she'd discovered. She's nervous but determined. This is about justice, about protecting the congregation she loves from the wolves disguised as shepherds. Pastor David Mitchell is already waiting for her, along with someone Margaret didn't expect to see. Church Board Chairman Robert Chen, the man who'd been handling the church's finances for the past 4 years. Margaret, Pastor Mitchell's voice carries a warmth that doesn't reach his eyes. I understand you have some concerns about our financial management. Margaret opens her folder and begins laying out the evidence. Bank statements showing suspicious transfers. Donation records that don't match expenses. A paper trail that leads directly to personal accounts controlled by Mitchell and Chen. You don't understand the pressures of church leadership, Mitchell says, his pastoral mask slipping. The sacrifices we make. The community expects so much from us. Those donations were for God's work, Margaret replies, her voice steady despite the fear creeping into her heart. You stole from families who trusted you. From children who needed programs. From people with nothing who gave everything. What exactly are you planning to do with these allegations? Chen asks, his voice carrying an edge that makes Margaret's blood run cold. The right thing, she answers. The congregation deserves to know. The police deserve to know. That's when Margaret Hayes realized she wasn't leaving the church alive. What happened next in that sanctuary would haunt Millfield forever. 2 men she trusted, served alongside, and considered spiritual family revealed themselves to be capable of the ultimate betrayal. At 6:47 a.m., Margaret Hayes died clutching the evidence that could have saved the church and sent her killers to prison. 1 bullet to the heart, fired by Pastor David Mitchell while Robert Chen watched and planned their cover story. But killers, even those who preach about divine forgiveness, make mistakes when adrenaline and desperation cloud their judgment. Mistake 1. They left Margaret's purse in the church office but staged the scene to look like a robbery, forgetting that no thief breaks into a church at dawn to steal from someone who's already inside. Mistake 2. They overlooked security cameras from the hardware store across the street. Cameras that recorded both men's cars in the church parking lot 20 minutes before Margaret arrived. Mistake 3. Most critically, they didn't know that Margaret had already mailed copies of the financial evidence to her sister in Nashville, along with a letter explaining her fears about confronting the church leadership. When the first police officers arrived at 8:15 a.m., called by early arriving congregants who found their beloved Sunday school teacher dead in the sanctuary, they walked into a crime scene that would expose the darkest secret Millfield had ever kept. Detective Sarah Walsh had worked in Millfield for 8 years, but she'd never investigated a murder in a church, and certainly never one involving the town's most respected religious leaders. The initial investigation seemed straightforward. Robbery gone wrong. Margaret Hayes was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Tragic, but not complicated. That narrative lasted exactly 48 hours. On Tuesday, October 17th, Margaret's sister Linda called from Nashville. She had something Detective Walsh needed to see. A package Margaret had mailed 2 days before her death, along with a letter that began, "Linda, if something happens to me, make sure these documents reach the police. I'm scared, but I have to do what's right." The financial documents Margaret had discovered told a story that transformed the investigation from a simple robbery to a conspiracy involving the highest levels of Millfield's religious community. But Detective Walsh was about to learn that investigating small-town corruption is never simple, especially when the corruption involves people who still wielded enormous influence over the community. When news broke that Pastor Mitchell and Board Chairman Chen were suspects in Margaret Hayes' murder, Millfield faced a crisis of faith that threatened to tear the town apart. Pastor Mitchell is a man of God. He would never hurt anyone. Margaret must have misunderstood the financial records. Church accounting is complicated. This is an attack on our faith, on everything we believe in. The congregation split into 2 camps, those who believed the evidence and those who refused to accept that their spiritual leaders could be capable of murder. Friendships ended. Families stopped speaking. The town that had been united by faith found itself destroyed by the truth. Detective Walsh found herself under increasing pressure to find alternative explanations. Maybe Margaret had been confused about the finances. Maybe the real killer was still out there. Maybe the evidence was being misinterpreted. But the evidence was clear, and Detective Walsh had something many small-town investigators lack: the moral courage to follow the truth wherever it led, even when it led to the most trusted members of the community. Modern crimes leave digital footprints, and Margaret Hayes' murder was no exception. Detective Walsh's investigation uncovered an electronic trail that painted a clear picture of premeditated murder. Phone records. Pastor Mitchell had called Robert Chen at 11:47 p.m. on October 14th, 20 minutes after Margaret called requesting the morning meeting. The conversation lasted 38 minutes. What were they discussing for that long, if not planning Margaret's death? Bank records. On October 12th, 2 days before Margaret's call, Chen had made unusual transfers from church accounts to personal accounts, as if he were accelerating the theft before discovery became inevitable. Email evidence. Most damning of all, investigators found deleted emails between Mitchell and Chen discussing the Margaret problem and how to handle the situation permanently. But the most powerful evidence came from an unexpected source: the church's own security system. Millfield Community Church had recently installed a basic security camera system, not to catch criminals, but to monitor the building after a series of vandalism incidents. Pastor Mitchell had forgotten about the interior camera that covered the sanctuary entrance. 6:31 a.m. Mitchell and Chen are seen entering the church together, Mitchell carrying what appears to be a handgun. 6:42 a.m. Margaret arrives, enters the sanctuary where the two men are waiting. 6:47 a.m. The sound of a gunshot is picked up by the audio recording. 6:48 a.m. Mitchell and Chen are seen leaving separately, Chen carrying Margaret's manila folder of evidence. On October 25, 2023, 10 days after Margaret Hayes' murder, Pastor David Mitchell and Robert Chen were arrested and charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy, and embezzlement. But the real shock was still to come. Margaret Hayes' murder was just the tip of the iceberg. As investigators dug deeper into the church's finances, they uncovered a network of corruption that extended far beyond simple theft. The money laundering scheme. The church had been used to clean money from Chen's legitimate construction business, fake invoices for church work that was never performed, allowing Chen to hide income from tax authorities. The political connections. Some of the stolen church money had been funneled to local political campaigns, buying influence and protection for the scheme. The charity scam. Several local charities that were supposed to be receiving church donations had never actually received the money. It went to shell companies controlled by Mitchell and Chen. Most heartbreaking of all, investigators discovered that the theft had been going on for over 5 years, meaning hundreds of families had been robbed of their faithful donations while their spiritual leaders lived lives of luxury funded by their congregation's sacrifice. The trial of David Mitchell and Robert Chen began on April 15, 2024. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Maria Rodriguez, presented a case so overwhelming that even the defendants' high-priced lawyers couldn't mount an effective defense. Financial expert testimony. Forensic accountants traced every stolen dollar, showing a clear pattern of systematic theft that enriched Mitchell and Chen while impoverishing the church they were supposed to serve. Digital evidence. Phone records, emails, and security footage created an undeniable timeline of premeditated murder designed to cover up years of embezzlement. Community impact. Congregation members testified about the programs that never materialized, the repairs that were never made, and the charitable work that was never funded, all because their money was being stolen. But the most powerful moment came when Margaret's sister Linda took the stand, reading from the letter Margaret had sent her before her death. "I've discovered something terrible, but I can't stay silent. These people have betrayed everyone who trusted them. If something happens to me, make sure the truth comes out. The congregation deserves better than wolves in shepherd's clothing." On May 3, 2024, after deliberating for less than 3 hours, the jury found both men guilty on all charges. Mitchell received life in prison without parole. Chen received life with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Today, Millfield Community Church has a new pastor, new leadership, and new financial oversight procedures designed to prevent future corruption. Margaret Hayes' sacrifice wasn't in vain. It saved the church she loved from complete destruction. Her Sunday school classroom now bears a plaque, Margaret Hayes Memorial Room, dedicated to truth, justice, and faithful service. Every week, new children learn about faith, honesty, and the courage to do what's right even when it's dangerous. The congregation has grown stronger in the aftermath of the scandal. They've learned that true faith doesn't require blind trust. It requires vigilance, accountability, and the courage to confront corruption wherever it hides. Every financial transaction is now reviewed by multiple people. Every donation is tracked from collection to expenditure. The congregation has learned that protecting their church means protecting it from those who would exploit it. Margaret Hayes died because she refused to let thieves disguise themselves as servants of God. She paid the ultimate price for her integrity, but her courage exposed a conspiracy that could have continued stealing from faithful families for years to come. In small towns across America, trusted leaders still exploit the faith of their communities. They hide behind respectability, behind religious authority, behind the assumption that people who preach about morality must themselves be moral. Margaret Hayes proved that assumption wrong, and showed us that sometimes the most faithful thing you can do is refuse to have faith in the faithless. This has been Man's Dark Nature, where the evidence speaks louder than the headlines. I'm your host, reminding you that the most dangerous criminals are often those we trust most, and that sometimes the only thing standing between corruption and community is one person brave enough to ask the hard questions. Remember Margaret Hayes. Question authority. And never let anyone tell you that faith means staying silent about injustice.